Okay, let's pick up with part 2 of our introduction to Peter, and then we will be getting right directly into the passage itself. So let's join into the discussion by the Apostle Peter himself. And so I have a note here about Peter, and very obviously, look at this particular chart that I have where we see parallel between what Peter wrote and what he had in his sermons in the book of Acts. Notice in Acts, this is at the beginning of Peter's ministry. Okay, he's one of the older apostles, and yet he had these truths where he's talking about Jesus and the predetermined plan by God, foreknowledge of God, in putting Christ to the cross. And look at that in 1 Peter. He was foreknown before the foundation of the earth and was made manifest in these last days for your sake. So he's using similar language when he's referring to the Lord. And, and then in 1 Peter 2, so you also believe, see his eyes for those who believe. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stumbling stone and a rock to trip over. Notice in his sermon in the book of Acts where he says in verse 11, this Jesus is the stone that was rejected by you. The builders became the chief cornerstone. Okay? And he's referring to things that Jesus taught about this as well in the book of Matthew. And I have to tell you that we can study this cornerstone idea also with the Apostle Paul. It's seen in all of them. It's a very important idea. And then in 4:5, they will face a reckoning before Jesus Christ, who stands ready to judge the living and the dead. Acts 10:42, one of his later sermons in Acts before he fades away and Paul comes into the motion. We see that he has commanded us to preach to the people and warn them, okay, that he is appointed by God as judge in the living and the dead. So notice the language similarities between 1 Peter and his sermons. Over the years, Peter had a theme, right? And a ministry. So you would expect to find that, right? Anyway, I thought that was cool. Now, we've talked about the purpose, Jesus helping us through hurtful times. There are a number of themes that are said here related to the suffering of Christ, about the church being God's people. We're actually even a priesthood of believers. There is a theme throughout this book that we have a hope in our end-time inheritance. There's a theme in this book that Jesus died as a substitute for sinners, and his death was the basis for their new life. Okay? And at the resurrection, of course, another theme, Christ will triumph over his enemies, and Christians, in relationship to this, should live righteously, holy, in their homes, okay, husband and wife, in their homes, with their children, in their business. They should live righteously, they should live holy. There should be a consistency of behavior, whether or not people see it. Our behavior is always based because God sees everything, and he is the one. So even in our private moments, we should be reflecting this holiness. And Nobody's perfect on this one. I grant you that. But it's the kind of thing, this holiness lived out in life. It's like love being lived out, which is the next theme. It should be an ongoing, ever growing experience with more and more and more of our life. Okay? How I treat kids, how I treat my wife, how I treat uh, humble people, how I treat my peers, how, how I live. This is how I live, you know, and it's a bigger how shall we live than even some of the thought that we've had in the last 25, 30 years on that. Living a righteous, holy life should be really big in our whole life. So our new life should be the basis for love and holiness, okay? And both should be a growing experience, growing all the time, more and more. As we get older, we should get more gentle. As we get older, we should be able to show more love. As we get older, we should be able to be more kinder. As we get older, we should be more compassionate to those who are struggling with sin and with things that are harmful. You know, we are taking on the person of Christ as he's in our life and he's growing in us. Okay, and we should not be legalistic and hurtful, in secret. We shouldn't be mean and coveting and mean spirited and gossipy. No, it should be quite the opposite. And, that's what we have. So, in the white on this one was his paragraphs, and then he has his topics that he went through the book with, which is really, really good. And then his own outline, very similar to what we've already seen with other people. Okay? Now, I just want to tell you that Peter wrote the book. It's always been agreed on that Peter wrote the book. It's only been recently that people have tried to reconstruct that Peter didn't write the book. But when you go into any kind of evidence for it, internally in the scriptures, externally outside the scriptures, all the evidence points to Peter wrote the book. To construct a fabulous structure that he didn't write it goes way beyond anything that we can actually look at. And it's a theory that doesn't have a whole lot of basis. It has been postulated in recent years, very recent actually, that Peter but the Greek here in the letter is too cultivated for a Galilean fisherman. Now, we've already had an example of a Galilean believer who wrote a very fine book in James, very much, with the beauty that you would find in the book of Proverbs. Now you have a Galilean fisherman who's writing First Peter, and they just think that the Greek is too good for Peter. They think that theology is too much like Paul, not enough about Peter. They don't like the fact that Peter uses the Septuagint. He should have used Hebrew, they think. And they also think that there was nothing in the history of time of Peter where it was a worldwide prosecution. Those worldwide prosecutions in the Roman world came with later emperors. Okay? And they think that Peter should have talked more about the historical Jesus, And when we look at how Peter talked about Jesus, okay, just recognize that, like a good writer, Peter is control of his content. First Peter is not a retelling of the gospel. To expect it to be a retelling of the gospel would be inappropriate, or that's a word we use too much today. Not just inappropriate. It would be limiting what a writer could write about, because he had some other things to write about. He didn't want to write out the life, the works, and the word of Christ as he lived out his life in some type of gospel tract. No, this was a letter written to help people in hurtful times. So he uses illustrations back to the Lord, in light of the fact what he's writing about. So he's writing about, therefore, prepare your minds for action, keep sober in spirit, fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. He's making some kind of reference to be dressed in readiness. Okay, keep your lamps lit. Be ready, be prepared. And he's talking about suffering here, so he's alluding to something in the Gospels that gives him part of the context of what he's talking about. And then he's not quoting here, is he? He's not quoting here, but he is making a careful connection. And here in 2:12, Peter, keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that the thing which they slander you as evildoers, they may, did I read that wrong? So that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, and glorify God in the day of his visitation. And, quite frankly, they may be very bad to you. They may be very evil to you in this life. But I guarantee you, when the Lord comes again and revisits this evil, the truth is going to come out. You were doing something that God wanted you to do. And, of course, that's what Jesus was teaching, right, in 5:16. He's talking about persecution. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they might see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And again, blessed are those who have been persecuted for my sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Peter's referring to that in 3:14. But if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled. Okay, so that's really, really some excellent things here. Okay, now, here's where Peter ministered to. Okay, here's where Peter ministered to. And you see here Bithynia, and Galilee, and Pontus, and Cappadocia. You see those northern regions. That's where Peter wrote to, and that's where his ministry went. He was a good missionary. Paul was going to go to these areas. Jesus wanted Paul to go to places where nobody was going, So Jesus sent him west into Thessalonica, Thessalonica, but into Philippi and into Greece and further into Rome. Peter, he was to go into these areas, and he built up a church there, and he's writing to these people in these northern areas. He certainly went to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. By the time of his writing here in 62, 64, he's writing from Rome, okay? And we get that in reference to Babylon. Babylon at this time is in ruins, the real Babylon, and there's nobody living there. In the Babylon that Peter was at, Rome, a reference to Rome, which is what we see in the book of Revelation, there's a lot of people. So he's in Rome. We know he's in Rome. Eventually he's going to die in Rome, roughly around 68 AD. But he's writing to this group of people over here. And it's just wonderful to see. Here is a Peter that finally gets it. Yeah, he failed. Yeah, he did all sorts of things. But I want you to know that Peter's life illustrates failure, but it was never final. Never final. How many people have really cut into Peter over the years? How many people have given Peter no love? They're just almost cursing that Peter was doing all these things, denying the Lord, doing the other things, and Peter was only speaking what we would have said, what we would have felt. People that know the Bible know this. They know this. We wouldn't have never been able to do any different than Peter at that time. We would have failed too. Just thank God our failure wasn't recorded in scriptures, but Peter's was. And even though he failed, he failed to bring the ministry consistently to the Gentiles. He failed in things. That wasn't the final thing. That wasn't the final thing. That's what Peter shows us. Peter gets it right. Oh, we will remember him in his youth, with all of his shortcomings. But can we see him as Christ made him? Jesus himself told Peter what he was going to do in his life. And if we don't believe Jesus, then who can we believe? Peter became more than his failure. He actually has a ministry, both to Jew and to Gentile, and increasingly Gentile, using the Septuagint to help them understand it. And by the way, it would have been the same practice for the Jewish people in these communities. They would have been more accustomed in the Greek areas here to also use the Greek Septuagint of the Old Testament. Okay, and that's just a fact. So anyway, these are excellent things that we can get into. Okay, now there was no way that I can actually shorten this, so sorry. But here's our worksheet. Okay, here's our worksheet. And this is what I like you to do. Fill in your paragraphs in those thin lines. This is all based on the New King James Version. Fill in your chapter headings, what you think they are. Then make your own summary. Write out what you think the book is about. And it could be different than mine, and that's good. Okay? So that's the chart that I have for you today that I like you to work on. And take your time with it, but read at least one chapter at a time, but I'd like you to read the whole thing first out of an easy translation like the Holman Christian Standard, the New King James, the Living Bible. I was thinking more the NIV, even reading it out of the Phillips translation, written in paragraph form, especially any translation you choose. Read it that way, and then go back and read it again. You could do a chapter at a time if you want, or you could do the whole thing and just sit down for a nice little mental and spiritual feast. You'll enjoy it. So that's what I like for the homework. Okay. And of course, what I came up with, here's my little colorized version. I hope you can appreciate. And I sort of like to leave you on this note. Human experience and suffering may have many different outcomes. They can actually be out of our control. We are not as strong as we think. Okay? Yet, many have great results. Salvation is assured regardless of our weakness. We cannot underestimate the evil of Satan and his kingdom. We are saved from our past sins when we receive Christ. We are being saved and delivered day by day in our Christian experience. Regardless of what some may say, we don't have to get resaved again. And because salvation is of God, we will be saved by the very promises of God. You have to believe this. God has to reveal this to you. Your salvation is based on what He said. Perseverance is always a goal. But let's be very gracious in the spiritual battle. There are many who will be shell-shocked, and they will have all kinds of problems. So we continue, as we get older, we continue to walk with the Lord. We continue to cast our cares on the Lord. They may increase, and they may be many, but we do that. But if we falter because of human weakness, remember, He is faithful. All right? He is faithful. And our faltering may have more to do with the fall and with disease and with the struggle of sin than and I'm going to tell you, some of this is out of our control. Now, as long as we're healthy and we are mentally and spiritually aware, we can overcome sin. But there are many things in this life that we cannot control, and bad things can happen. So we persevere because we have a hope, even in the most hurtful time, that we are going to be with the Lord, and He's going to make it right. So I hope this encourages you. God bless you. Until next time. Or YouTube. These studies can be found at our church website. I hope they encourage the people who are studying them. I'm learning as I go, and I think that they're getting better from my point of view. Always play them maybe at a little faster speed, and then have a good time looking at them again to help you do some of your own Bible study with it. My little figure here comes from one of my early reading of mysteries with the saint, and I always liked his little figures, so I've incorporated it into mine. We don't have little halos walking around, but nevertheless, it's a little fun.